Well, good morning to everybody in the United States and good afternoon to our colleagues and friends in Germany. My name is Rob Fenstermacher. I'm the Chief Operations Officer at the American Council on Germany. We're really pleased to do a timely event, which is something we're always trying to do when current events come up, that we're very quickly able to get some wonderful experts and folks to talk about the issues. And today's topic of conversation is whether or not there's now a new crisis for the governing coalition, the case of Professor Frauke Brosius-Gersdorf and her judicial appointment. As I'm sure everybody knows who's on today's event, about a week and a half ago, what's normally a pretty quick decision by the Bundestag to confirm and empanel new judges for the Federal Constitutional Court, or the Bundesverfassungsgericht, was postponed because it looked like there may not be enough votes to get specifically Professor Brosius-Gersdorf appointed and confirmed. And this was due to the CDU and CSU not having enough votes in their own parties. So this is really, I think, the first crisis for the coalition specifically. There are a lot of crises that the government is dealing with since they came into government, and this has now been added to their plate. So we're really pleased today that we have two wonderful experts who are going to have a conversation. I'm going to sign off and let them take things on. For the United States and in Virginia, we have Professor Russell Miller, who's the J.D. Stombock Professor of Law at Washington and Lee University. He's an expert on German law and the Bundesverfassungsgericht. I know Russ from many years ago. Together, he and I spent a year as Robert Bosch Foundation Fellows in Germany, and it's wonderful that he's continued to stay so active in German law affairs, and he's going to lead the conversation today with Professor Dr. Alexander Thiele, who is Associate Dean for Research and Interdisciplinarity and Chair for State Theory and Public Law at BSP Law School here in Berlin. He's told us as we were in the green room that he's been incredibly busy this week, given the issues and doing a lot of media events. So again, we're very happy that you have the time to talk with us all today. So with that, Russ, I'm going to turn it over to you two to have a great conversation, and I'll sign on at the end.
Yeah, okay, Rob, thanks so much. I want to also say thanks to the American Council on Germany for putting this together and giving Alex and me a chance to connect like this. I always learn a ton from my conversations with Alex. So, and of course, Alex, I can say this is the sleepy holiday season in Berlin, so everything should be quiet and not much is going on. I know that the French, the French are debating whether they should do away with some holiday time, but this is the quiet season. But that's of course not at all true in Berlin in this time. Before we dive into the specifics of the case of, and I have to say I like seeing that her name is being abbreviated as FBG in the German media, because that resonates so well with the legacy of RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, here in the U.S. But maybe we could just do a quick, very summary treatment of the basics here before we wade into the specifics of the case. Maybe you could say a little bit about what the Constitutional Court is, the Bundesverfassungsgericht. What's the nature of the judgeships there? And by that, I think I mean who appoints them, how long do they serve, what's the process involved in appointing them? Maybe we could get the foundational basics in place and then turn to the specifics of this controversy.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, of course, also a warm thank you from my part here for being invited to this fantastic session. I think it's a great idea to talk about this case from a more sort of international perspective also, and bringing in especially the American experiences, Russ. Because of course constitutional courts around the world are somewhat being attacked currently from different sides and different groups, and we are somewhat seeing similar things happening here in Germany now. So let's talk about the Constitutional Court. Of course, it sits in Karlsruhe, and a lot of people know a lot about the Constitutional Court, but it has a lot of differences to it, especially when compared to the American Supreme Court, of course, right? And that starts with the number of judges. So we have 16 judges, but we have 2 senates. It's a twin court, a peculiarity that goes back to when it was founded in 1949. So we have 2 senates composed of each 8 judges, and each of them, when they judge, judge as the constitutional court. So it will usually only be sort of specialists and experts knowing that that was the first Senate or was the second Senate. That's not covered usually in the media. This might also change now, Russ, due to this debate we're having here. So we have two Senates composed of eight judges. You have to be 40 years of age in order to become a judge, at least 40 years of age. And you have to have the first and second state exam. That means you have to be qualified to become a judge in Germany. So we have an expert judicial court, one might say, which is not necessarily the case if compared to other constitutional courts around the world, right? Some of them also allow sort of non-legal scholars or legal positions into the court, not so at the German Federal Constitutional Court. And of these eight, also 3 of each Senate have to come from the highest federal courts. So you have 3 professional judges, so to speak, in each Senate. The other 5 will usually be consist of professors, sometimes politicians, and more rarely lawyers. So that depends on sort of certain aspects when it comes to the appointment of these judges, which brings me to the appointing institutions, which is the Bundestag, so the parliament, for half the judges, and the Bundesrat, so to speak, the Senate, untechnically spoken, right, in Germany, that votes for the other half. And in both of these institutions, you need a 2/3 majority, which is obviously very different to the situation in the US, where you have the majority in the Senate, the simple majority or the absolute majority in the Senate. But this 2/3 majority, and I guess we'll talk about that later on, what that actually leads to, requires obviously the majority in each of the houses to reach out to the opposition. Right? They can't sort of just vote anybody they would like to have into the court, but they have to reach out to the opposition. So that leads to the idea behind that, of course, being that you will have sort of 8 judges altogether. None of them will be too radical, right? Because the opposition would not sort of be willing to vote anybody into the court who appears to be too radically one-sided in their respective positions. So they are then.
I have one technical question, if you don't mind me jumping in.
Sure.
I know this is a brutal thing to say. Summarize your most profound legal institution in a few minutes. But you made reference to the idea that some of the justices at the court in Karlsruhe should also already have been federal court judges, and I think it'd be worthwhile highlighting for the attendees today the fact that the Constitutional Court exists, I guess we could say, on a kind of jurisprudential island. It's a federal court in its own right, but it's carved out, it's set aside. It doesn't operate alongside what Germans often refer to as the ordinary courts. Maybe you could say word. Maybe you could say a word about, and this arises because it's true, some of the justices at the Constitutional Court are meant to have had experience long-standing professional experience in the ordinary courts at the highest level. And then they move sort of laterally, upwards and laterally, to this special tribunal. Maybe you could describe that landscape.
Yes, we have, that is something, of course, indeed. I might have just held that for granted, but you're right. That's a big difference, of course, to the American Supreme Court, which is actually not a constitutional court as such, but is simply the highest court you have on the federal level and deals with any kind of questions, right? The German Constitutional Court goes back to a concept that was developed by Hans Kelsen. So it's an extra court within the federal system that stands, the ordinary courts would say, next to, the Constitutional Court would say above the other courts, and only deals with constitutional issues. So it's set up to not to sort of interfere with the ordinary court system and with the ordinary courts in which we usually find with 3 instances, right? You have some sort of county court or whatever, and you have a higher court, and then you have the federal courts. So that's the usual end of the story for in normal proceedings, right? But in exceptional cases, as you said, and when constitutional questions arise, then you can actually reach out to Karlsruhe to have this specific constitutional question answered, not the questions of the ordinary law and the ordinary statutes. that's intermingled, of course, right? But formally, from a formal perspective, you will only have the constitutional questions being dealt with in Karlsruhe. But as we all know, or probably most of you know, the case law of the Constitutional Court has actually made it possible to interfere practically everywhere, to be quite honest. But from a technical perspective, there's a huge difference between these two court systems. And indeed, these three judges will bring sort of judicial experience into the court, because in the end, it's still a court, right? And a lot of these justices within the Senate will not have worked as a judge during their whole lifetime, but they've been professors doing whatever they dealt with, but they weren't sort of working as judges in their former career. And apparently, they are the ones that get stuff done within the Senate, because they have sort of this practical approach. And then you have the professors on the other side, so always wanting to talk about everything and go on and on and on for ages, and sort of making the judgments even longer. And then you have these three professionals going like, guys, we have to decide this court case. Get on with it, right? So it's a good mixture sort of sort of science and research on the one hand, and practical approaches on the other, that has helped the court sort of to be so successful. Let me just point out one final very important difference when it comes to the German Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court. That's lifetime tenure. The Supreme Court has lifetime tenure, and you know what that means. And I think everybody in the United States has experienced now what that means. This 6-3 sort of composition of the court at the moment. That can be problematic at least in some cases, and has shown to be problematic maybe in some cases, is going to stay that way as long as these people literally live, right? So if they don't resign, of course, they could resign, but that's not very common, right, to do so, at least not in the ages that most of these judges have now. I mean, we're talking about, Justice Thomas might be resigning or something, but there is sort of a lifetime tenure, and which is very different to the German system, where you have a tenure of 12 years. And the whole idea is actually being that you want sort of to have a new ideas, and especially new value compositions of the society, slowly also reaching the court. So in actual fact, one of the big success stories of the Constitutional Court is this not lifetime tenure that ensures that value compositions changing in society will eventually reach the court, making it possible for judgments to change according to the idea that the court obviously is the court for the current society and not for the past society, right? So this is something I think is very important and distinguishes it greatly from the American Supreme Court. And we can see that within the judgments. They change over time. We don't have a strict precedent procedure, so the court is from a formal perspective free to decide whatever it wants. It doesn't have to look at precedents. In actual fact, when you look at it sort of empirically, you will see it actually doesn't change its decisions as often as the Supreme Court has done lately, to be quite honest. So it is very reluctant to do so, but it can do so, and it will do so when it has the feeling that its former decisions will not be accepted by the current society anymore because of value change and so on. So that is sort of the brief overview over the court and its distinguished differences to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, thank you for that. I assume many of our participants today have that foundation and background, but I think it sets up some of the color and adds some dimensions to the controversy. I know that you have been both professionally and maybe even at some level personally involved in the controversy, and I want to get to that with you in a few minutes. But maybe you could just set us up with the framework to give us the characters and a synopsis of the drama, and then we'll turn to your reaction and the broader community's reaction to these events. But how was the process leading to the appointment of 3 new justices at the court supposed to have proceeded? How is it that FBG, this professor in Potsdam, became
notorious FBG, by the way,
notorious FBG became such the focus of controversy? How did this particular process come off the rails? And then I'd like to hear from you a little bit. Describe how the community of professors and the larger political community has responded to this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, as I said, usually nobody would actually have noticed anything of this, and it would have been a page 7 side mark on the newspapers or
Yeah,
something
I
like
have
that.
to say, Alex, that the old legend is that sometimes appointees don't even know it's happened, and they get a phone call from the press saying, "How do you feel being elected to the court?" And they'll say, "Well, this is the first I've heard about it." So
yeah, it's more or less like that. So to be quite honest, as I said, you have this 2/3 majority requirement. And of course, you have the 12-year tenure for the justices. So it doesn't just happen like that the political arena will sort of know we've got to start looking for judges, new justices within the community. And then depending on which position it might be a position, and one of the 3 here is in actual fact one of these positions where you need to have a former federal judge, right? That's the one from the CDU. The appointee is actually a former judge on the Federal Administrative Court. And the 2 others were assigned to the SPD. Now, as I said, two-thirds majority will require the appointing party to reach out for the opposition. And there's this informal rule that sort of the 2 bigger parties, that's CDU and SPD, each appoint 3 of the judges of each Senate. And the Greens appoint 1, and the Liberals appoint the last one. So that's the 8. Now, whether this will hold due to the changing majorities within the institutions, that's another issue, but that's sort of the rule. So when it came to these 3, it was clear that 1 was supposed to be appointed by the CDU, and the other 2 were going to be appointed by the SPD because they were on the SPD ticket before. So far, so good. So what then happens is that each of the appointing parties, the CDU on the one hand and the SPD on the other, reach out to possible positions. Yeah, and sort of for themselves think who might be an interesting candidate. And as soon as that is agreed upon within sort of the SPD on the one side and the CDU on the other side, they go to the other party and present their appointees and ask, is that okay? So all of this happens outside of public, right? There's nobody involved. Nobody even knows about this. And at this point, indeed, Russ, usually not even the possible appointee will actually know yet. Yeah, in order so not to destroy his reputation or her reputation. So, and then it's for the respective 2 parties to agree upon this candidate mixture. And this is what happened here as well. So the CDU, Jens Spahn, as being the party, the fractional leader in the Bundestag, said we're fine with that. We're fine with Frau Brosius-Gersdorf. We're fine with Ann-Kathrin Kaufhold. On the other side, the SPD said we're fine with Spinner, he's called. So everything was fantastic. Everything was going on track. And then the SPD reaches out to its candidates and actually calls them. Yeah, Frauke was just going to call. So do you think you would like to, would you be able to, would you sort of, yeah, so this sort of still behind the scenes talk you would then have. And apparently she then took 1 or 2 days of thinking because of course it's a big decision. I mean, she's now 54. She lives in Berlin. I mean, she would have to move to Karlsruhe. Her husband and her family might have to move to Karlsruhe because you have to be present in Karlsruhe. It's a full-time job. I mean, it's a horrible job, actually, to be honest. I mean, you work from day to night, actually, more or less. We have 5,000 cases per year that these 2 senates deal with, right? But she then eventually said yes, of course, believing that from a political perspective, things are on track. Now, but that already was only half true, though, because as we need the 2/3 majority, CDU and SPD don't have this 2/3 majority, and therefore they would necessarily have to reach out also to the left party, which the CDU, however, is unwilling to do, and they just hope, well, they wouldn't not vote her, right? The left party. But it was still an open question what was going to happen with the CDU appointee, actually, because the left actually said they would not vote for him. So were they actually risking to get votes by the AfD? So already at this point, it was sort of a not quite common, not quite usual situation. And things then got completely out of track a few days before the proposed election process within the Bundestag. Because from a formal perspective, the Bundestag only decides in a plenary decision after the so-called election committee has confirmed these candidates. So on Monday, 4 days before the election process, and with already things heating up a little, the election committee actually confirmed with a 2/3 majority all 3 candidates. That was on Monday. So again, the political sphere actually said, we're fine with all these candidates, even though things were already heating up outside. And after candidates had been confirmed by the election committee, it has never, ever in history occurred that this vote would now not go through in parliament. Because according to the statutes, there is no discussion on the candidates within the plenary session. It's simply the vote, that's it. However, things got out of control from this point on, and the main issue that sort of gave rise to all this heat coming up in the media and in the press and in the public was the position on abortion, which was seen as by Prof Brosius-Gersdorf, which was seen as problematic by parts of the union and also the church, but in the process was not only exaggerated, but simply misrepresented in public completely. She was said to propose having abortions in the 9th month of pregnancy and so on. She was called a children killer and so on, right, in the media. And the church was completely jumped onto this as well. And many right-wing press portals took advantage of this too, to launch some kind of a campaign against her, to which parts of the union in turn responded, which is very despicable, to be quite honest. But also the church got carried away with some defamatory statements, but at least today has apologized a few days later now because it had been misinformed, as it said. But finally, and this is very sort of problematic from a scientific perspective, on the day of the election, accusations of plagiarism arose that were not only not well-founded, but then were used by the parliamentary group from a formal perspective leadership to postpone the election. So they didn't actually say they don't want to elect her for her positions, but on the Friday election day, they said, now we've got to check these accusations of plagiarism, which were ridiculous from the start. And now that these allegations have been obviously cleared up, they were, to be honest, they were bullshit from the start. The SPD is now insisting on new election of Brosius-Gersdorf because they say, well, you didn't reject the election due to her positions, but for plagiarism, which is not happening, which wasn't there. So please elect us now, elect Brosius-Gersdorf. And that's the situation we're in today. And now, in actual fact,
I want to hear a little bit about the reaction more broadly and your involvement in that. Let me ask one point of clarification. You suggested that the plenary has no debate around the final election, and in fact, no candidate leaving the Judicial Appointments Committee has ever stumbled on the way to Karlsruhe. But just remind us, it had not always been the case that the full plenum of the Bundestag elected these Constitutional Court justices. In the past, I think maybe the process suffered a bit from accusations of operating, behind closed doors and smoke-filled closet rooms, and in the past, the appointments proceeded exclusively at the Judicial Appointments Committee, and it's only a recent development, a relatively recent development, that the appointments have moved to an election of the full plenum of the Bundestag. How recent is that change? And was that change in some sense an invitation to this kind of broader political, and for good reason, you might say, to lend some political legitimacy to this process? Let's move these votes out of the cloakroom and the back rooms and the Einstein Cafe on Unter den Linden and out to the the broader, more political discursive space. Give us a little bit of background on that part of the process.
Indeed, when you look in the basic law, actually it says that half the justices are elected by the Bundestag and the other half by the Bundesrat. And from 1951 to 2015, actually. So it's 10 years already, Russ. I know, I think it's recent, but it's been 10 years.
It feels so recent to me.
It feels very recent, but it's 10 years. So in 2015, that was changed. But up to then, Frau Brosius-Gersdorf would actually have been elected already because she passed the election committee, as I said. Yeah. So she would have been done. Now, there were always constitutional, it was always seen as constitutionally problematic that they only have this election committee, because it was not foreseen within the basic law. And we had a court case actually coming up, which was dealt with by the Second Senate under the leadership of Andreas Voskuhle at the time, who then said that this is constitutional. However, the court would recommend sort of maybe one should think about bringing it into the plenary session. And so on. Just a side note on that, as a legal scholar, Andreas Voskuhle found the voting only by the election committee as being unconstitutional. So it was very interesting to see what he was going to do as judge. But as a judge, of course, he could not say that all elections of all judges in the last 50 years were unconstitutional. That would have sort of given rise to sort of questioning all judgments of the Constitutional Court. So he said it's constitutional, but wink, wink, please change it. So it was changed in 2015. Again, already at the time, people were afraid that this might lead to some sort of politicization of the vote. So immediately they wrote into the statute that it's just the vote, no hearings or of any sort within the plenary session. In order to avoid that, and only to ensure sufficient democratic legitimacy, it is sort of put into the hands of the plenary decision and of the plenary session. And to be quite clear about this is another fundamental difference between the Supreme Court and the German Constitutional Court. It's completely depersonalized in public. Nobody knows a judge. No, and when I say nobody, I mean including most students of law. They would not be able to name a judge of the Constitutional Court, apart maybe from, well, now one or two might know Brosius-Gersdorf, but she's not a judge yet, or we'll see if that happens. And some of them might know Stefan Habert as being the president, because he sometimes appears in the media. But otherwise, it's more or less frowned upon, actually, for the judges to appear in the media or give interviews. They rarely do that. They just sit there, and it's completely depersonalized, the Constitutional Court. We don't talk about the decision of Justice XYZ. We don't know who actually drafted the decision. We don't know who was involved in the decision. We know which Senate was involved, but we don't know sort of the impact of any of the judges. It's a single decision signed by all judges, and that's it. We have concurring and other sort of special votes here and there, yeah. But the rule is you have the simple judgment by all 8 judges. So it's completely depersonalized, and there was a big fear that when changing this procedure, that it might get personalized.
We might end up where we are today.
And we might end up where we are today in the situation of Brosius-Gersdorf, with, of course, at the time, nobody foresaw actually sort of how bad it might get with the right-wing media, with campaigns on social media and so on, which now, of course, make it a lot easier to personalize stuff. And my big fear is that we've sort of seen the last easy vote, and that's it now.
Let me ask a couple of follow-up questions. You could round out that summary of the controversy that's erupted by saying a couple of words about how the broader community of academics, let's say, but also maybe civil society, even the political segment in Germany has responded to this. I'd like you to have the chance to say a little bit about how you've been involved with a few of your colleagues. But in the process of updating us on reactions to this controversy, please underscore for us, what is the literal current state of play? Is the nomination dead? What can we expect to happen next? Yeah. And then after we hear your reactions on this set of questions, I've got a couple of maybe some broader themes that we could explore.
Yeah, well, first, I was, of course, I mean, in the scientific community, you always hear about sort of the nominations a little earlier, right? We know each other, and I have to disclose this as well. Of course, I know Frauke Brosius-Gersdorf very well. She's one of the editors of one of the renowned commentaries on the basic law. I'm also an author within this commentary, so we've worked together. We know each other. We've known each other for 10, 15 years, maybe. I don't know how long. And she's a fantastic scholar, just to be quite clear about that. Fantastic scholar, renowned, accepted in the community. Nobody would have ever thought of her being left-wing, as she's being framed at the moment by the public and parts of the media, at least. I mean, if anybody had asked me, name a left-wing scholar in this field of constitutional law, nobody, including me, would ever have thought of Frauke Brosius-Gersdorf. And if anybody had told us that she was being framed, we would have laughed, to be quite honest. Yeah, because she's got very liberal positions, somewhat even conservative positions when it comes to in the economic field and so on. So at first, I knew about this. I congratulated Frauke sort of informally, because I knew that this was fantastic, how fantastic for the court. And then I saw with amazement what happened in the public, seeing that she was being seriously damaged when it comes to her reputation, her personal life. She was being threatened. She got death threats by post, by media, on social media. She was completely falsely cited when it came to her scientific positions. As I said, she actually, when it comes to abortion, proposes a solution that is very close to the one we actually have when you look at the practical differences. It's from a dogmatic perspective, she has a few sort of clarifications that she proposes in order to sort of clear up the current case law of the Constitutional Court, which is not very clear in some parts. And so from a dogmatic perspective, she has few propositions that would change a little, but from a practical perspective, hardly anything would actually change when you come to the actual situation. But in the media, she was, as I said, framed as the child-killing, plagiarian, left-wing activist, which is simply so unfair and so not true. And after a few days, a colleague of mine, Stefan Huster from Bochum, and myself said, we gotta sort of show some sort of solidarity. I mean, this is gonna go past the political sphere, but this is gonna stay when it comes to Frauke Brosius-Gersdorf. Every time you Google Frauke Brosius-Gersdorf, it's gonna come up. So we said we have to put something on the internet that also comes up and shows that it's bullshit. So we wrote a letter of solidarity on Saturday, saying that this is not the way you can treat people who are asked. She didn't apply to become a judge. She was asked by the political sphere, questioned the political sphere whether the majority was there, got a yes, then said yes, and then got this reaction in the public. And without the political sphere sort of standing in front of her and saying, guys, this is too much, we have to stand before this, our appointee that we wanted. And as that didn't happen, we said this is not something that can sort of be accepted when it comes to this process. The German Constitutional Court is a court that has successfully combined practical, as I said, judges with the scientific world, and it's one of its big assets, I would say. And we need people willing from the scientific field to be willing to actually accept such appointments and actually willing to go to the court. And if we as soon as a professor is appointed, find that his legal and scientific positions are simply misrepresented in the public, that's nothing we can accept. So we wrote this short letter, only a page, saying that the political sphere has completely not done its job and so on. And on the Sunday after the vote, 2 days after the vote, we then sort of asked a few friends to sign. And the reaction was overwhelming, Russ, to be honest. We have now 350 professors from all areas, not left-wing, not right, all liberal, everything. We've got everything. We've got 5 or 6 former federal court judges that signed this letter. I'm still today getting people wanting to sign this letter from the academic field. So it was crazy what actually happened. And by Monday midday, when we actually then published the letter, we had almost 300 signees, which is a ridiculous amount, to be quite honest, when you know how reluctant the judicial academic area is to propose itself in public. And that's when sort of the media started. And I was quite glad, actually, that sort of the focus shed away from Frauke to us, because we then had the possibility to explain what was actually going on. The people could see that the people that had signed this letter were not only from some sort of left-wing university, but we had, as I said, all political fractions were actually involved. And I think this helped her a lot, sort of taking away the pressure a little and showing that she is indeed someone who is in the middle when it comes to the scientific area. And
then I asked this question. Give me a sense of where you think this is headed. Where is her appointment or nomination? I guess we formally should refer to it as her election. What's the status of and likely fate of her election? And then maybe we can shift to a couple of broader questions.
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean, the whole political arena actually sort of failed in doing what they would have to do in such cases, I would say, including the SPD here as well, because it was their candidate, so they should have sort of stepped in a lot earlier to protect her. But the biggest mistake, of course, in a lot of ways, was done by the CDU-CSU that sort of didn't know what the majority was in their faction, and then postponed the vote due to this plagiarism. As I said, not due to her positions. So they've got themselves into a dreadful mess now, because of course, as the plagiarism accusations are dealt with, they shouldn't have any problem now anymore. But of course they do, but because of the abortion thing, which one can stand for, or see however one wants to see it. But it should have been sort of been cleared a lot earlier. And the SPD now is saying exactly that. Lars Klingbeil, the head of the SPD, has said we're sticking with Frau Brosius-Gersdorf. We're not taking her away and presenting another scholar. And the CDU, on the other hand, is more or less silent at the moment, because they know that they have got themselves into a real mess. It's been postponed now to probably till the mid of September. But to be quite honest, I don't really see a solution. And I would say Frauke Brosius-Gersdorf, some people say she should resign, sort of saying, taking back her willingness to apply. But I would say, well, then people have actually won this, that shouldn't win such a discussion, because it was completely irrational what happened here. And she was asked, as I said, she didn't apply, and then she's treated like she was. And then people say, now you have to solve this by going away. I mean, what kind of political attitude is actually that as a solution, I would say, yeah? So I would say, no, she, at the moment at least, I would say, and she's not willing to do so. She said she would do so as if she has the feeling that she's actually causing a fundamental crisis in government, and if she might sort of encroach on the Constitutional Court and the standing of the Constitutional Court, but that's not the case either at the moment. So it depends. A lot will depend on how the CDU-CSU actually now reacts and talks to the SPD.
I have to say, really this was one of the really interesting parts of the important letter that you helped curate and foster and push forward with the support of so many voices in Germany. It's a letter that both says that the personalization and the qualifications and the portrayal were false. That's an important point to make. But I'd say the heavier weight in the letter is the condemnation towards the political culture, the political professionalization around this process. And that allows us to step backwards a little bit. You know, I've heard the tone of that also in your answer to these questions. Let's draw back to a bit higher or more remote perspective. How problematic is this for the coalition? You know, we've used the term crisis. You know, maybe it's hard to say it's a crisis if everybody's on vacation right now, but we've used the term crisis. Of course, this isn't the first vote that the CDU and Chancellor Merz lost in first short run of his coalition. The first vote they lost was the vote for his election to the chancellery. And so here in the span of a few months, it looks like there's weak discipline in parts of the coalition, maybe poor performance from both parties, but also weak discipline. Can you give us a sense of how you read the political costs or consequences of these developments for the coalition, and maybe you could try to give us some insight into where is the problem in the coalition? What parts of the CDU would be affected, or the union parties would be affected by these allegations to cause the stress that the coalition is under?
That's the most I would say the most problematic aspect of all this, because as I said, we need a 2/3 majority for this vote, but the problem wasn't the 2/3 majority. The problem wasn't that the Linke, the left party, didn't comply with anything. It didn't even get to that point. The problem was that the coalition as such, the coalition itself, wasn't able
if
to
this
reach...
were a strict majority vote, there would
exactly. They wouldn't even have been able to have an absolute majority within the Bundestag, even though they had the absolute majority, in a very, as I said, usually unpolitical question of appointing a judge for the Federal Constitutional Court. And that is that my biggest fear is that this is a sign for something that might follow us and haunt us for the next 3 years. Because we talk about the CDU and SPD as being a grand coalition, and we've had a lot of grand coalitions. Now, first of all, they're not that grand anymore, right? Because the majority isn't that big, because the SPD is struggling, of course, as we know. But if you look deeper, then you also see that the former grand coalitions with Merkel and the SPD and the CDU were far closer together when it came to certain aspects of politics. I mean, this is one of the big critique points that came up for the Merkel era, was that she didn't distinguish the CDU sufficiently from the SPD. And that was true in many parts. But of course, it made coalition finding and being together in certain aspects much easier. Now,
so this is already a very fragile coalition, is what you're
exactly. The
very
CDU is already
coalition, and something as straightforward as the appointment. Straightforward. I'll use, even if we want to use air quotes around that. Something as straightforward as the basic operations of governance, impaneling a few judges from time to time, can create real stress within this fragile coalition. What's at stake if this maybe not so grand coalition, this fragile grand coalition, can't hold the line, can't learn to function?
Let me just, before I answer that question, sort of give one more insight into the current situation, because the Merz CDU, I just want to make that point, is of course a lot more, has sort of moved far more to the right, not right extremist, but to the right from a political perspective than the former Merkel CDU. And the SPD, in order sort of to gain more character, let me put it that way, has tried sort of to promote its more leftish approach in a lot of perspectives once more. So already this requires a capacity to compromise, a room for compromise that is much bigger.
So it's smaller in number. Before. It's smaller in number, and they're farther apart ideologically.
Absolutely. So that already stresses the coalition. And we see here that this stress might indeed actually lead to a disaster when it comes to really big questions. And the SPD has already agreed to certain decisions of the coalition when it comes to asylum law, that they really had to sort of talk with each individual member of parliament in order to make sure that the party actually stands. And they stood. And now they say, guys, we more or less sort of gave up one of our main feature here in order to make it possible for Merz to be the hardliner when it comes to asylum law. And now you're not willing to vote for a judge who is in the liberal era, fall for right-wing campaigns, and then tell our candidate to go away. What are you talking about? A lot of members in parliament are saying you're ridiculous if you believe that we will sort of change out Frau Brosius-Gersdorf now. So, but when you step back, you can see that this is a far bigger problem, and it's not a problem of the 2/3 majority, because for normal life in the parliament, they need their majority. That's it. They will, when they want to change the constitution, and there are certain aspects where they might want to change the constitution, the CDU-CSU will have to talk to the left party. And apart from that, as I said, even if they have the majority of their two factions, we still have no vote of the judges yet, because they have to talk to the left party in order to be willing, that has to be willing to comply with what they want to do. And they haven't even spoken to them yet. So even if they reach a consensus here, the problem is not solved when it comes to these three judges. because it is clear that none of them want to have the votes by the AfD. But as I say, altogether, governing has become much harder due to more parties, different parties, and the willingness to compromise actually has to widen. But it appears to be that within the parties, the area for compromise has actually sort of gotten smaller over the years, and we need a new sort of culture of compromise.
Yeah. Let me pose, one additional dimension, of course, to the degree that we might see that the union parties haven't held the line on this particular episode. One way of perceiving that is, of course, that they must be reaching out to the SPD somewhat on the left, but as well are expected, considering the crisis of the AfD, to be shoring up, what would we call it, something like the right flank of German politics as well. Is it your sense that this particular episode is a product of the CDU's struggle to manage holding that right flank? Is that a fair way to read this particular episode?
Well, as we know from legal scholarship and from political science, it's usually the Conservative Party that decides on the future of democratic order when it comes to sort of attacks from the right. I mean, they have to stand. It's them. It's not, I mean, that the AfD doesn't want to work together with the left party is clear. Yeah, the natural partner is the Conservative Party that exists, and they want to destroy that Conservative Party, or at least split it up into a more radical part. And that's what's been happening in the last few years. And I would say that this is the first time that you can see it actually being successful in parts. Because when you look at X, the Twitter accounts and so on, and social media, you see quite a few Christian Democratic members of parliament that sort of were involved in this campaign and that have openly proposed. Actually, one of them, Ms. Ludwig, who's only now very quiet because she's accused of plagiating her dissertation as well, after having accused Brosius-Gersdorf, which is quite funny, actually, to be honest. So she was sort of one of the major voices, and she had already proposed working together with the AfD in January, actually. So we have certain members of parliament within the CDU-CSU faction that are actually, some more officially, some less officially, some more sort of in the background, are trying sort of to push this very conservative, in their view, whilst others might say it's already right-wing extremist positions for the CDU. And I would say that the CDU has not yet shown to be able to deal with this in a manner that is that clearly distinguishes them from the AfD. I mean, we haven't heard anything of the leadership of the CDU concerning these members of parliament. Nothing so far, absolutely nothing. They're just letting it go, and I think that's a big mistake in my view. And I would say that this is going to keep us sort of has to keep us aware for the next 3, 4, 5 years.
Hey, I have, we're you and I could have this conversation. As I said, I've learned so much from my interactions with you over time, and as well today. There was one facet of this I'd love to have your feedback on. It's really troubling to me to see this unfold around the appointment, proposed election of a female candidate to the court. Yeah. Maybe you could say a little bit about the history of women at the court in Karlsruhe as justices, and give us an impression of whether you sense that this is in some sense motivated, driven by the gender dynamic in her appointment as well.
Well, as you might imagine, when you look at the Twitter reactions concerning her possible election, you have this sexist, misogyn stuff all over. And in actual fact, we had a big discussion, Stefan Huster and myself, with the third colleague, when writing the letter, whether we wanted to put this into the letter as such, the sexist approach and so on, this anti-feminist approach and so on. And we, in the end, decided against that because we said we didn't sort of want to have this focal point in the letter, because everybody would then immediately sort of try to make this culture war up and so on. We didn't, so we left it out. But I strongly believe that this is a part of the whole campaign, of course. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the picture, she's a good-looking female, and sort of she has no kids. That immediately wasn't pointed out. Oh yeah, she has no kids. That's why she wants to kill them and so on. It's ridiculous stuff coming up on the internet. So yes, I would say that was part. But that was not our main part of the critique at this point, because we made it a more general thing. But I would agree. When you look at the history of the German Constitutional Court, of course, it was a court of men from the word go. Usually, we would find in the 50s and 60s, one at the most two female judges within the court. But that changed recently, and for the last few years, 1.5 decades, I would say, it's been a court that is more or less composed of equally men and women. We even had a short period where we had 9 female judges and 7 male judges, and that was indeed actually a first pager in the papers for once, because of course that was a big thing. But otherwise, the court is in many ways, as I said, so depersonalized that there is no discussion, neither concerning the composition as such, nor in specifically the composition when it comes to men and female justices. At the moment, we have 9 to 7 men, I think, again, but I'm pretty sure that it's going to be more or less equal for the rest of the court's existence. And female judges, of course, have made a significant difference when it comes to the judgments, I would say. The climate judgment was framed by a female justice. Quite a few other aspects, and I'm pretty sure that the abortion cases would have not led to the outcome they led to if it hadn't been for at the time, I would say 7 male and 1 female judge in the court, and a very conservative and Catholic court with Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde, a fantastic scholar, but at that point I think his Catholic roots sort of influenced his judgments in quite a significant manner. So at the moment, we have a very equal court, and I would say that's a fantastic thing. And actually, nobody really talks about the sex of the judges anymore.
In this sense, maybe you could give us a little bit of feedback on or background. How often have appointments, maybe not in such a spectacular or risky political manner, dissolved, fallen apart, but have there been failed? What I guess we would say back in the old days, maybe floating the name of a possible candidate. Have there been failed or withdrawn appointments or candidacies to the court in Karlsruhe?
Yes, there have, and usually, and there have actually been quite a lot, but usually they will not reach the public, because the professional parties that really work professionally, and we've had that. It's sometimes not even the possible appointee that actually gets to know that he was actually on the list, and then got pushed away again due to some sort of critique that the other side brings up. And this is, and to be quite honest and clear about that, that's fine. I mean, you have the 2/3 majority. That's the whole idea. You have to take in the opposition, and if the opposition says this is simply not acceptable for us, then it's okay. That's fine. Even if the reasons might not be well founded, that's fine. That's the whole idea. So that has happened. But there have been certain cases, and one of the most spectacular one was, of course, Horst Dreyer. And as I can see, Russ, in the background is the Dreyer commentary. In your background, the 3 blue books with the little red dots there. That's the Dreyer. That's this fantastic commentary on the German basic law. Horst Dreyer is one of the, probably currently, I would say, the most respected and the most valued legal scholar when it comes to constitutional law, and he was proposed then. And again, interestingly enough, first of all, it's the doctoral supervisor of Frauke Brosius-Gersdorf, to be quite honest, so that closes the circle somewhat. And then it was again a campaign led mostly by the Catholic Church that had sort of that didn't agree with certain alleged positions, one has to say, that Horst Dreyer actually didn't write in his commentary, but then the church sort of got carried away when it came to human dignity, and that was unfair as well. But it never reached the election committee. It never reached this part of the process, and he was never confirmed within the election committee. And at the time, he would have already been elected then, of course. But the whole campaign was also not very fair to Horst Dreyer. And most people that actually led the campaign today admit that, actually. I've spoken to quite a few journalists also who were involved in this and sort of had commentaries in the big newspapers at the time. Because, of course, at that time, 2008 it was, I think. No, was it even earlier? I don't know. No, it was even earlier, right?
Yes.
I don't know.
was around 2003. I mean, I hit the
3 or 4. Yeah, exactly.
That was troubling. Was him reflecting dogmatically around questions of torture and human dignity, and that arose.
Exactly, and him sort of at least thinking about whether this would be possible, where dignity stands against dignity, and so on. So it's a fantastic commentary. Everybody who wants to know about human dignity should read that commentary, because it's fantastic and brilliant. But it was held against him anyway. So, but that's something that didn't, of course, sort of reach this level because we didn't have any social media, right? I mean, the classical public, to be quite honest, never really got involved in this, and it was never against the person as such. Horst Dreier was never sort of as a person was never being attacked. So, but it was a very public case, and that's the last big case. It was, of course, Andreas Voskuhle who then got the position and who led the court then for the next 12 years. But apart from that, we have the odd sort of rejection of the candidate here and there, and but nothing like this.
And again, always set against this extreme ambition of gathering 2/3 majority support for a candidate. That means, a candidate was at risk for merely, getting close to the danger line of a 1/3 opposition, and that would be enough to have imperiled the candidacy in the past. We're at the end of an hour. We've tried to pick up a few of the questions that have floated in. One just came in, and I know you are a close observer to maybe the science of social media, certainly far more than me. But one question that has come through asks whether we have any confirmation that the attacks on FBG's candidacy were also the product of the abuse of social media and wherever that might have emanated from. Whether this is an orchestrated attempt to be disruptive of German democracy and German democratic processes, and including outside interference, whether this is in some sense just simply a generated controversy, maybe from even outside. I don't know if you have any reflections on that. It's not really the expertise of constitutional scholars, but I know you followed the social media.
We will know that probably in a year about, because we have now, of course, people trying to exactly examine this question. But we have first sort of statistics showing the social media transactions and what was going on. We have 4 or 5 right-wing media that really sort of jumped on this at a certain stage. I wouldn't say it was a concerted campaign or anything in the classical manner that you have sort of from top down, people sort of saying, now we're going to do this, now we're going to that's not how it works. These right-wing campaigns work differently, right? So that they live from the fact that everybody can get involved in these discussions, and that's how they sort of try to by publishing misleading articles about the people, how they sort of get other people to get involved that speak of it as a scandal and so on, and then it's sort of you could see this spiraling up. I was following X. It was ridiculous. What ridiculous comments about Frau Brosius-Gersdorf came up, and I tried sort of to hold against it, but it's ridiculously the amount is just it's impossible. Sort of, it's absolutely impossible. And then you have these big news companies, these right-wing news companies, that actually called News, N-I-U-S. It's pronounced News. That has some big interviews of sort of in this American style manner. I'm not sort of generally talking about American style manner, but these people that just sit there and sort of go on about this person for hours and hours and hours, and that was being shared on social media all over the place. And then, as I said, the church jumped on this mistakenly. They admitted that, but I mean, that was, of course, something when the bishops actually said, one bishop, and he explicitly apologized for this, but he said the election of Frauke Brosius-Gersdorf would be a fundamental attack on the German constitutional order. And I mean, that is ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, he might have problems with her positions from a Christian perspective, fine. But you can't say that one of the leading legal scholars, her election would be a fundamental attack on the constitutional order, letting her stand there as sort of being a Verfassungsfeindin, yeah, an enemy to the constitution, which is ridiculous. And as I said, he apologized, but the damage was done already within hours.
Hey, see Rob coming on. As you can see, Rob, there's so much for me to learn in this conversation. I hope this has been beneficial for the attendees. We've tried to pick up some of the questions as they filtered in.
Yes, on behalf of the American Council on Germany and our entire membership and everybody who attended today, I thought this was amazing. The amount of information that you gave us, not only on the Constitutional Court so that we could understand it from a broader perspective, the comparisons to the US Supreme Court, and then the whole texture of this crisis was just phenomenal. And I know I speak for everybody in thanking you so much for this incredibly engaging conversation. There's a lot to think about. And I know I would love if you could maybe come back, because we did not figure out how this is going to be resolved. I think that's still a big question. And I think, Alex, you said it might be as far out as September when the election might take place again. So perhaps we'll have you back in September to talk about this.
Happy
Hopefully
to fly to New York anytime, Rob.
Wonderful,
Happy.
wonderful. We'd love to have you in person as well. Well, thank you both. I hope you have a wonderful evening, Alex, here in Berlin, and Russ and everybody in the United States. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and we hope to see you at our next event. Thanks,
Alex,
everybody.
Thank you
so
very
much.
much, and
Thank you,
hope to
Rob.
see you soon, guys. Bye.
Yeah.
Auf Wiedersehen. Ciao.